He's a very clever technician of power. They swallowed democratic institutions. Those democratic institutions were working mostly for their interests, not for interests of most of people in Slovakia. There will be attacks on civil society in order to have a consensus within the European Union. Many European politicians might be closing their eyes about the qualities of rule of law and democracy in Slovakia.
Mr. Michal Vašečka is a Slovak sociologist and the president of the Bratislava Policy Institute. He has been focused, among others, on the issues of extremism, populism, and civil society. And I'm really grateful that you took the time to sit down with me and talk to Prague Pulse, not only about the recent Slovak election. So thanks so much for being with us, and good afternoon to Bratislava.
Good afternoon, and thank you for the invitation.
Let me start right away with the obvious, which is the recent Slovak election that Slovakia held in September 2023. We're shooting this interview in early November. Actually, we have had a new Slovak government for a few weeks, days now. And Robert Fico, who actually had been the country's prime minister 3 times already before this election, won again, and with a pretty comfortable lead, I would say, over the second progressive Slovakia. So let me start with a simple question. When you think about the election, what's the first emotion, the first word that comes to mind about the result?
That's a tough question, and some people might be surprised. But bearing in mind what happened in Slovakia, that Mr. Fico returned, and he is creating a government even with stars of a disinformation scene who are representing Slovak National Party, somebody might say that there is not enough space for enjoying the situation. But I must say that the first emotion that comes to my mind is simply certain reveal that it might have been even worse, and I expected it in many ways. And I'm not talking about support for individual political parties, but long-term value orientations, patterns of behavior that we see from public opinion polls in last not only few years, but I'm analyzing it since basically 90s, right. And I see how it's not changing dramatically. So in many ways, I expected dramatic situation that Mr. Fico might get a constitutional majority. He didn't. So my first impression is, okay, it will be unpleasant in many ways. And let me tell you what I mean by unpleasant. I don't think that Mr. Fico is in his position for just 4 years. That might be 8 years very easily. So the situation that was typical for Poland in the last 8 years, we might produce in Slovakia as well. So I'm taking certain optimism from people who are saying, okay, it didn't materialize into something meaningful, but in 4 years it will be fine. I don't think it will be fine, but at the same time, I don't think it will be tragic. I believe Slovakia will be not turning into authoritarian, autocratic state quickly. There will be a lot of attempts, but I believe that some of them will be unsuccessful.
Being optimistic is, of course, a great thing, but let's try to be pessimistic at the start and, imagine the worst case scenario. So you said it could have been much worse, and you already mentioned a possible constitutional majority that Fico might have gotten. So what else could have gone much worse than it actually did? When we think, for example, about the small parties that didn't make it into parliament, could have probably...
Absolutely, and you basically suggested what's a certain source of optimism. In fact, in Slovakia, in the last 30 years, the society was polarized into two parts of society. It was basically 50-50, and always Slovak Democrats were able to create some type of government which was inconsistent, and very often not working properly, but at least simply to defeat open enemies of open society. They were able only when they were not making any mistakes, and all of them made it into the parliament. And also when the other side, so to say, made some mistakes. And this is exactly what happened in Slovakia, because fascists from Republika didn't make it into the parliament. Kollár and his Smer rodina didn't make it into parliament. And also Hungarian party Aliancia didn't make it. And, now somebody, let me just make a note here. I'm not against the representation of Hungarians in a parliament. On the contrary, I believe that this is almost a tragedy that the Hungarians don't have a representation in Slovak parliament. But unfortunately, Aliancia is already very much subordinated to Orbán and Hungary in general. So to face the situation that you have even openly pro-Orbán political party that is in parliament and might be cooperating with Fico, that's something that we don't need and we don't want to see. So in fact, from the other side, so-called democratic, or if you want pro-European, pro-Atlantic side, only Party Demokrati didn't make it into the parliament. So in fact, the other side's losses were much greater than of democratic. And again, this is saying something about potential for the future. This time, at least the mistakes were not dramatic.
Before we continue, if you're enjoying our content, please consider subscribing, clicking the like button, and ringing the bell. It really does help the channel grow and allows us to bring you even more in the future.
So maybe let's start a bit more general, because a lot of our audience is actually either from the region, but not directly from our countries, which is great. But also we have a sizable majority of our viewers actually from outside of Europe entirely. So maybe if you could explain why our audience, even a global audience, should care about the result of a Slovak election. And then we can go a little bit more into detail about the parties we have mentioned, be it Republika, be it Boris Kollár.
Okay, this is down-to-earth question why people should care about Slovakia. But let me bring you several answers which will be not self-centristic, so to say. First of all, Slovakia is a part of the European Union, and if you want, also of the so-called Global West. And the Global West is increasingly under attack by not only various types of enemies of open society, but enemies of the West. I'm talking about Russia, China, I'm talking about Iran, and many, many others. The problem is that the line is still longer and longer. Slovakia is a relatively weak part of the chain, and always the weakest part of the chain might be the target of these enemies. In case of these elections, Slovakia was very visibly under attack of propaganda coming from Russian Federation. We knew about it. Slovakia was not able to protect itself properly, and this is also the result of those, of those elections. So people might care about it because we are so to say sharing one boat. The second issue is that Slovakia is a Central European country, and Central Europe, unfortunately, although I'm a great fan of Central European identity, and I do possess Central European identity, Central Europe was basically serving as a warning sign of various events that were happening later and influencing the whole so-called Global West. Let's not forget, the World War I started here. The World War II started here in former Czechoslovakia. It actually started in Sudetenlands. And even fascism and communism were born basically in this part of the world. So Central Europe is basically a certain warning sign what might happen in the West just slightly later. This is a testing ground. So I'm always saying people from the West, so-called West, should be watching all countries of Central Europe, because definitely they will be affected by the spillover that might affect them. So that's the second reason. And the third, I must say that Slovakia as a sociological laboratory for political scientists is incredibly interesting. And I'm not saying it only positively, because it brings also many problems. But knowing some of countries in the region, I must say that Slovakia is sometimes difficult to live in, but it's definitely more appropriate as a laboratory. So I recommend all those who are interested in unexpected results of elections and interesting turns in a political scene. Once you will watch Slovakia, you will be never really disappointed. Look, in Poland, and that will be just last example, in Poland, in elections, we basically knew what is going to happen. We knew that only 5 political parties or coalition will make it to parliament, that there will be not the 6th one. So in a way, result was spectacular for Polish Democrats, but at the same time, it was relatively boring, I must say. In Slovakia, you are never sure. So it's a very nervous and incredibly interesting until the last moment when all those votes are counted. So that's just small recommendation for those who were not watching Slovakia really on everyday basis.
Thank you so much for that answer, because that's actually one of the main reasons why I started this channel. I also believe that the region is enormously important for the entirety of Europe and maybe even for the world in general, especially now with the conflicts that you also mentioned. But that brings me to one of the points you made. There are a lot of enemies of Europe, of the let's say Western liberal world order, if I may. And that brings me back to the election into Slovakia. Would you say that Robert Fico himself is an enemy of the West or of the Western way of thinking? Because let's remember, and I also mentioned it in one of the previous videos, that he himself was the one spreading pro-Kremlin propaganda and lies. So what does it say about him?
It's a difficult question to be answered in a nutshell. Most importantly, Robert Fico is not an ideological person. Unlike many others in the region, in case of Kaczynski in Poland, you can disagree with Mr. Kaczynski, but you see that he believes in something, that he is actually in some aspects very ideological. This is not the case of Fico. Fico is speaking about values incredibly empty, and he's a very clever technician of power. I must say that he's one of the best technician of power I saw in my life. In much bigger countries or more important countries, bigger, let's say in Germany, or more important, let's speak about Israel, Mr. Fico would be a star of politics as well. And he would be very, very influential on a world scale, so to say. But that doesn't mean that he's not empty. So everything is extremely utilitarian, and in this respect, Mr. Fico is definitely not a person of not only not human rights and minority rights, but even Western values, or I would even say any political values, and that complicated the whole picture. So I would say that he's enemy of open society, but once he would live in a society where he might benefit from just supporting human rights initiatives and to be supportive of various types of inclusion, he would do it. This is the point. He would do it, but it wouldn't come from his heart. So in a way, this brings certain hope for the future in Slovakia. Once Slovak inhabitants will change their views of certain elementary key issues that are encompassing Western values, people like Fico will be changing as well, because in fact they don't care.
If I understand you correctly, he basically does the things that he sees as most valuable to his career, to his survival as a politician, which maybe is also the reason why back in 2007-8 he was the one who actually finalized Slovakia's accession to the Eurozone. And now the very same Fico is spreading pro-Kremlin and anti-EU propaganda, right?
That's true. Although, and let me mention something, because you are not the first one who is mentioning how Mr. Fico brought Slovakia into Eurozone. And those of us who remember those times, it's technically it's true.
At least he wasn't blocking it.
Exactly. This is what we should be saying. He was not blocking it, because once he made it to government in 2006, in fact, he was starting his first government in 2006 with a lot of criticism of a previous government, Mr. Miklos, and his initiative to join European, Eurozone. And then many economists explained it to him that this is his chance, and he might benefit from it. So again, he benefited from it, obviously, as a prime minister. But now, I might suggest that he is lacking one important element of all autocrats, and that's, opportunity to use your national currency and eventually devaluation of that currency for your political games. Suddenly there is a Frankfurt bank which is directing the whole game. And this is far from being, the, so to say, wet dream of autocrats, because limits of Mr. Fico's politics are, very strong here. And so he has to manage the economy in a way that people like Orban or Kaczynski wouldn't be very happy, honestly speaking.
True. Maybe he is sorry now that he wasn't blocking Slovakia's entry to the Eurozone. No, but we're not economists, either of us. So let's go back to pure politics. You mentioned that he is a technocrat, maybe one of the best we've seen in the region. Is that, would you say, one of the reasons why he managed to come back to power? Because let's remember, he has been plagued in many scandals, corruption allegations. He probably was even tied to the criminal group that had Jan Kuciak, the journalist, killed. So how come he even made it back to power?
Okay, let me react on Kuciak. I don't believe that he was connected anyhow with the murder, but his responsibility for the whole thing and accountability here is the fact that he was tolerating for years people like Kochner. He was tolerating various types of entrepreneurs who were behaving in a way which is absolutely inappropriate in a modern economy and modern society. So, he has a political responsibility here than the real one. And why he returned, there are many theories and suggestions, but one is exactly what you said. He understood what is the profile of his voter, what is the profile of his potential voter, and he was not hesitant to start to play the game on nationalist or even semi-fascist voters, and he started to radicalize his constituency. And this is not, it's not a game, because, and I'm not speaking only, just my impressions here, because there are also qualitative studies that were done on voters of various political parties. And if somebody would expect that the most radical voters were coming from Kotlebas LSNS or semi-fascist Republika, you would be wrong. The most radicalized and even extremist voters were voters of Smer. Smer, which was still at that time pretending that they are social democrats. After elections, we learned, I'm saying it with certain smile here, that they are not social democrats, that they are Slovak social democrats, not the gay social democrats coming from Brussels, whatever that means.
Actually, what he said, right?
This is exactly what Fico said. I was a little bit puzzled by that. What does it mean? What's the content of it? Slovak social democracy. So basically, he was saying that he's national socialist. I'm not suggesting Nazi, but national socialist. That he's not simply buying into the whole, keystones of social democratic and socialist beliefs that are typical for all social democrats within Europe. And honestly speaking, it's not only that they are not social democrats, but the rhetoric the Smer was using was a typical rhetoric of far right. And I would go even further, because when I'm comparing it to what we might eventually hear, from let's say AfD in Germany, from Brothers of Italy, from Le Pen, and some others in Europe, this is definitely less radical what we heard from Smer. So they even jumped over those who are named as far right in the European Union, and I must say that's surprising. But thanks to that, returning to your question, this is the reason why Robert Fico was able to return.
So would you say that when he spreads this anti-EU, pro-Kremlin propaganda, does he or Smer actually believe what he's saying, or is it just a pragmatic way to gain votes?
Smer is, of course, and obviously not completely homogeneous in this respect. And Robert Fico is very carefully playing with all those sentiments from the past. He was able, for those who are not coming from former Czechoslovakia, he was always able to nurture sentiments for 70s and 80s, for the times of so-called normalization and so-called Husak's normalization, referring to President Gustav Husak that time. And he somehow combined it this time with certain sentiments for authoritarian and fascist regime, which is bizarre to combine those two traditions. But among his voters, there is sentiment for both at the moment. And what is uniting them is authoritarianism, seeking autocracy and preferences of so-called tough interactions in politics. So basically, there is certain demand for a tough leader who would be deciding without parliament, without coalition partners, without civil society, and he was able to awake this demand, which is obviously very high in case of Slovakia.
Could you maybe remind our listeners what Robert Fico's background is?
Robert Fico is a former communist and very enthusiastic communist, by the way. He was a young person. He started to study at the law faculty in Bratislava in the middle of 80s. Immediately sent application to Communist Party. And as a very pragmatic person coming from a working class an environment from central Slovakia, he simply put everything on one card, that he would like to be successful within Communist Party. After November 1989, that dream somehow disappeared. And he started his career in Communist Party after 1989, which changed into Party of Democratic Left. And Mr. Fico slowly but systematically started to be the most popular politician of that party. Not only because he was charismatic to some, but also due to various topics that he was trying to sell to his constituency. One of them was death penalty, let's say. So for the whole 90s, he was a main proponent of re-establishment of a death penalty in Slovakia, although he knew perfectly as a lawyer, and I believe a good lawyer, that we cannot do it, of course, because Slovakia was a member of the Council of Europe. But he was just reading properly public opinion in a country, and he's doing it until now. In 1998, when he was the most popular politician of Party of Democratic Left, he was rejected as a potential leader of that party. He understood it as a betrayal of his colleagues in the party, and I believe he was right in that sense. And he decided to establish a new political party centered at the beginning. And here the problem starts, because right from the beginning, it was not a typical political party. It was rather kind of a LTD, basically firm which wanted to bring various entrepreneurs into politics. And what we learned later was that Smer was established basically as a party which was representing needs and various goals of several oligarchs who became oligarchs during Mečiar era in that wild privatization of 90s. And this is the curse which is accompanying that party until now. That it's very questionable whether it's a political party or just a very sophisticated structure which basically would like to make as much money from politics as possible. And so this is Mr. Fico, and since basically the 1999, he changed his views on various things. Firstly, they started as a center party, then they became social democratic. There were times when Robert Fico tried not to be very nationalistic. There were times when he was bringing various ethnic topics, to saturate his constituency. So it was changing. But the most important part, is that he's the politician who didn't change Slovakia practically at all for good. He was in power for 10 plus 2 years so far. And those 10 plus 2 years, because 2 years he was replaced by Mr. Pellegrini in the position of a prime minister. He didn't, he was not reforming the country. So country slowly but systematically started to stagnate and losing the ground, losing the steam, so to say, which was somehow being accumulated in years 1998, 2006, before he made it to power.
When you're saying that the country hasn't been reforming, could you say that he has been turning Slovakia into somewhat of an authoritarian state, as in Hungary, or is that a danger that Slovakia will be facing now?
You see, this is interesting topic. In the past, it was not really happening, but let's be careful here, because this is the most important argument of many who are basically saying now, why are you so afraid of Mr. Fico? He was in power for 3 times already, and he never introduced authoritarian regime like in Hungary. So what's the point here? But let's be careful. He didn't have to that time. In fact, I believe his game was even more sophisticated than in case of Mr. Orbán. People from Smer and the structures around Smer completely dominated Constitutional Court, Supreme Court, police, Prosecutor General Office, judiciary, and I can continue. So in fact, they swallowed democratic institutions. Those democratic institutions were working mostly for their interests, not for interests of most of people in Slovakia. So, once you are dominating completely, once you sterilized all democratic institutions, you don't have to attack civil society, independent media. On contrary, you can play a fantastic game in front of your partners from Brussels or from other countries who don't see any restrictions of human rights, minority rights. They eventually hear some weird rhetoric, which is not typical for self-confident Western country, but it's not materializing somehow into the paralyzation of those civil society organizations, etc. So everything looks fantastic. Now he realized that in a way it was a mistake, because precisely when you don't do some your job with as an autocrat with independent media and civil society, it might turn against you, because simply both independent media and civil society are playing the role they are always playing in every country. They are watchdogs of a rule of law. They are watchdogs of liberal democracy, or if you want, open democracy. So, and this was happening when Mr. Fico was losing his power, and when Mr. Fico went out of power after 2020. Now he has to secure at least most visible opponents. So I believe that there will be attacks on civil society, which will be more visible than in previous times, and those attacks might be very similar to the ones that Slovakia witnessed in 90s, during the Mečiar era. So most importantly in the years 94 to 98.
So for those who are not willing to, stay quiet and be loyal, would you say that they are in more immediate danger to their careers, to their independence than before? Because you could even make the argument that it was precisely independent media, watchdogs, think tanks that forced Fico out of power, because the unfortunate events around Jan Kuciak and the incredible work of independent investigative journalists were basically the reason of the turmoil, right? So are they now in more danger because he wants to stay in power and he will do whatever it takes?
Look, well, yes and no. There are people in certain positions where new power will be changing everything from the scratch. Police, general prosecutor, eventually, judiciary, in some positions. But in fact, I know where you are heading with your question. Most of people are not endangered, and on top of it, if you are living in a free, modern Western society, even if you will lose your job eventually in working for public administration, you can still work somewhere else. We are not in 70s. Free Western society brings also certain self-confidence, or should bring certain self-confidence, that you might have certain civic participation, and it will not harm you dramatically. This is the problem in countries such as Slovakia, and I see it in most of countries of Central and Eastern Europe, that people, although they are living in free societies, and sometimes even more free than what we are witnessing in so-called Western Europe, they are not enjoying it. And very often they don't want to participate in anything, and so they don't bring certain civic courage to public life, because they believe they eventually might be harmed by somebody. But
right.
That's the problem then, because of course this is like self-fulfilling prophecy. If the population is behaving in a certain way, enemies of open society will utilize it, because they see that people are already behaving that way. They are expecting it.
Obviously, when you mentioned, your average citizen, you may be right that he or she wouldn't care that much about the possibility of losing a job, because you always have a choice to either get a new one or even leave the country. But I was referring to the independent media, for example, think tanks that try to work to preserve Slovak democracy, to educate civil society, etc., etc. Are those institutions now in more danger than before the election, or is it probably just exaggerated?
No, it's not exaggerated. Some of these institutions will be under attacks, and those attacks will be sophisticated. They will be, of course, not done with the brutality of Mečiar regime in 90s. They will have to find the way. Positive thing is that once some of those independent media, let's say, will be not panicking, regime, even a slightly authoritarian regime, but still in a framework, legal framework typical for the European Union, cannot be as brutal as to close them down completely, to send police to arrest everybody from the editorial board. That cannot happen. So there will be unpleasant attacks, but I'm still saying that most of independent media, if they will be resilient, they will survive it, which of course will be deepening frustration on the side of authoritarian or semi-authoritarian regime. But I still believe that Slovakia might survive it if those people will be not panicking. And one important thing is Slovakia is more ready for such an authoritarian attempt than Hungary was under Orban. It's probably our experience from 90s that we went through the valley of tears in 90s and we learned our lesson with Mečiar era. So now, I would say, although we are speaking about a slightly different generation, that legacy is with us.
That's precisely what I wanted to ask. And even Orban in Hungary, if I'm not mistaken, needed more than one term to make his authoritarian system a reality, right? But you mentioned at the beginning that you fear that Fico as well may get more than one term now. But do you think that Slovak society is more resilient than Hungary and has a higher chance of making it, so to speak?
Yeah. I believe that Slovakia is more resilient, and also Slovakia is more heterogeneous, and that heterogeneity paradoxically might be helping here. What I'm afraid that that heterogeneity might be to a certain extent blocked and somehow changed by the changes of the electoral system. Mr. Fico needs a constitutional majority for it. But if in case they will decide it, they might benefit from it. They just need the support of somebody in the parliament, probably Christian Democrats, who might eventually benefit from it as well. They wouldn't behave, very logically if if Mr. Fico will catch them on this topic. But yes, I believe that there are certain steps that might endanger positions of Slovak opposition and changes of electoral system into majoritarian or semi-majoritarian or complicated system as we see in Hungary these days might eventually keep Mr. Fico in power for much longer.
Let's see what happens in the future. You're obviously a sociologist, so I would shift to more general question about Slovak society, although I know it's always more difficult to answer such questions. But when we look at a recent Globsec Trends survey, Slovakia has consistently been ranked as one of the countries most prone to disinformation. The highest proportion in the country actually believe that world affairs are run by secret societies and not elected officials, much more than other countries in the region, including Czechia, for example. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, and that's a good question. The first difference we might see between countries that have been part of so-called animal farm in the past, So countries that had a communist governments and those who didn't, there are stunning differences. Which we can see. Neighboring Austria, neighboring Germany, these countries are much less conspiratory than all of our countries. And so this is a legacy of communism in all of our countries. But having said that, it's obvious that Slovakia has also some special flavor here because it's even more so.
Sorry if I may interrupt. The differences are large even within the countries that all have been communist in the past, right? Czechia, Slovakia, Poland.
Absolutely. Or Baltic states, and Baltic states are much less conspiratory here. So the second answer is, and I would otherwise mention it as the last one, but many people are mentioning this is a result of Russian propaganda. But first of all, Russian propaganda was present in many, many other countries. And secondly, just by using propaganda, you cannot turn a country into this conspiratory hell. Because in case of Slovakia, we are talking basically about half of population, which is conspiratory. And that's something where the dynamic of the whole society is changing. Suddenly you are living in other type of society where words have different meanings. Normally you would say white is white, black is black. But suddenly, once you have half of population which is conspiratory, black might be eventually white, good might be evil, and people simply, a lot of people got lost in translation, so to say. Yeah? So of course the propaganda has been working here, but it was obviously falling on a fertile soil. So what I see behind it is very deep anomy of Slovakia as a country that has still is struggling with its identity. It's a work in progress. I'm not saying it negatively. It's a work in progress. Still, it's shaping into the form of a modern nation which has consensus about most important things from its history, who is important figure in the history of that country. And there are simply certain patterns of behavior that are typical for that country. Slovakia doesn't have it. Slovakia is colorful, but the truth is that it's difficult to run it. It's difficult to even understand it, because it's everything and nothing in a way. It doesn't have all those typical flavors of other countries. And what I see behind it is also something very special. Slovakia was always very rural country. When Czechoslovakia was established 100 years ago, more than 100 years ago, the biggest city of Slovakia was Bratislava with some 120,000 people, Košice 40,000, and the rest were small cities and basically rural areas. Just think about it. In Austria, you had big Vienna. In Hungary, big Budapest. In Poland, big cities that were always influencing the dynamic of a society. In case of Slovakia, those were rural areas which were influencing everything what was happening in the country. And now the most important question arises. Since Slovaks were always rural and those cities were predominantly German, Hungarian, Jewish, later Czech, we might pose a question: how much influential even Enlightenment was in this environment? I'm not saying it didn't influence the Slovakia. Of course it did, but those who were bearing, Enlightenment, those were the people mostly from urban areas who later disappeared. So we can pose the hypothesis that Slovakia was probably most likely less influenced by Enlightenment ideas than some of neighboring countries. Or those who were influenced later somehow disappeared from the country. And this certain element of being postponed in time is simply haunting Slovakia these days, and I'm positive that Slovakia will solve it. Slovakia will come to the point where others have been, let's say, 1 or 2 generations before, but it simply requires a certain time. And in that chaos, which is accompanying the very rapid modernization of the country, because Slovakia is definitely very modern, technically, materially, structurally, it's a very modern country. That chaos which is accompanying it, simply Slovakia has to survive. Simply Slovakia has to survive a period when the discrepancy between the structural part of modernity and cultural part of modernity are very visible. And this is how I see the situation in Slovakia. Simply, country is very modern structurally, but culturally, it's still the country which is just being finishing the modernization process, and it will probably require one more generation to finalize it.
That might actually be one of the reasons why some differences between Czechia and Slovakia are so large, right? Because at first sight, it might be striking to people like us that the differences are there, given that we used to share one country for a long time. But still, in matters like democracy on paper, in polls such as the Global Trends, the difference is quite large. The Slovak population actually says that liberal democracy is one of the biggest threats to the country. So are the differences that large, or is it just a feeling? And actually, what you said is that the background is the same, and the difference.
No, on the contrary, background is very, very different when we are comparing Czechs and Slovaks. But the truth is that now Slovaks and Czechs are relatively close to each other, and very often they are even reproducing the same patterns of behavior. The commonly shared life in communist Czechoslovakia influenced also similarity of our reactions. But the truth is that those nations were always very close to each other, and Czechs and Slovaks liked each other, but they were very different. Czechs were living in a part of Central Europe which was heavily Germanized. I'm not offending anybody here, even those who were fathers of a Czech nation like Palacký, Jungwirth and others, they were aware of it, that they are living in heavily Germanized environment, and they even had certain doubts whether they would be able to reestablish, to awake Czech society for the national project. In case of Slovakia, Slovaks were much closer to Hungarians and Hungarian identity, Hungarian mentality. We were sharing the same country with Hungarians basically for 1,000 years. So there were sympathies, but it's like in a marriage that, your partner doesn't necessarily has to be the same as you. You have sympathies even to a person who is very different. And I believe this was the case of Czechoslovakia, although in those long 75, 80 years, slowly but systematically, Slovaks and Czechs started to be, closer and closer to each other. But even now, when you see reactions of people to various political crises, economic crises, Czechs and Slovaks are still reacting very differently.
Let's move to the last topic I wanted to touch upon with you, and that's Slovak foreign policy under Robert Fico, because there have been some articles even in world-renowned media about how Slovak foreign policy will change. Of course, given how Fico has talked about Ukraine, the Kremlin in the past half a year to a year. So do you think that Slovak foreign policy will change, or is it just talk for the domestic audiences we've grown accustomed to, but on the world stage, Fico will be more reasonable, so to speak?
Yeah, complicated question. And I will return to the meeting in Brussels of all leaders from the European Union last week.
Exactly.
Where Mr. Fico, mentioned his views, where he criticized Ukraine, sometimes even in a very nasty way. He said, what's the position of Slovakia? But then at the end of the day, he voted in favor of everything what was on the table. And then here we have to return to the beginning. Mr. Fico is not ideological. Mr. Fico might have certain feelings about issues, but it's not that important for him as in case of Mr. Kaczynski. Mr. Kaczynski, when he was somehow involved emotionally into certain topics, no matter of what, he would pursue them against the will of anybody else. That's not the position of Mr. Fico. And what I'm afraid here is that he will try basically to arrange bizarre situation when Slovakia will be always presenting views that will be very close to the views of Mr. Orbán. But unlike Hungarian Orbán, Slovakia will be voting, supporting recent consensus of the European Union. But there will be price for it. And Mr. Fico will be saying it, I believe, very openly. And it will be basically this one. We have different views, but we are so constructive that we will support the European view. But there is price. Don't criticize our rule of law. Don't criticize our democracy in Slovakia. Don't criticize what is happening inside the country. And don't even dare to think that you might stop Eurofunds. As long as you will stick to these rules of the game, you will get our support. Bratislava will support everything what you in Brussels want.
Can this work?
And I believe that Mr. Fico is right, that this can work. So in a way, let me be dramatic here. In order to have a consensus within the European Union, many European politicians might be closing their eyes, speaking about the qualities of rule of law and democracy in Slovakia. So in a way, it might be sacrifice on the altar of a common European politics.
I'm just curious how the recent Polish election might change Fico's approach, because most likely Slovakia will have lost a significant ally in Poland, which probably will no longer be an ally of Orbán, right?
Absolutely, and this is changing the landscape. To have also Poland, which would be basically saying the same things as Orbán and Fico, and Poland is important, big, influential. So in this respect, to have just two troublemakers, potential troublemakers, Slovakia and Hungary, in a club. That will influence also the chances and potential of people like Fico. So somewhere at the end, of course, the certain skepticism that Fico's game with the European Union might be dirty, but eventually very fruitful for him. That somewhere at the end, I still hope that it might just speed up the process of changes within the European Union. What we hear, not only from Germany these days, that veto, politics within the European Union should be cancelled. Once we are thinking about enlargement of the European Union, not only Serbia, Montenegro, Macedonia, but also Ukraine. And obviously, once you have a club with more than 30 members, veto is simply really dangerous and problematizing the whole picture. But I believe this is not done predominantly because of Serbia or Ukraine is coming, but because of experiences with Mr. Orbán and eventually with people like Mr. Fico.
Exactly. That's one of the recent videos we made was actually on the reform suggestions by France and Germany. And that was to be one of my last questions to you as well, because exactly, I agree with you that reform will be necessary in the future, especially with enlargement, if enlargement is on the table. But on the other hand, Fico and Orbán don't look like people who would ever agree to an EU reform, right? Because you need unanimity for a reform. So of course, we're getting into speculations here, but what do you think might happen? Are we headed to a multi-tier Europe? More different layers, more categories of member states, or what will happen?
I don't want to pretend I'm expert on European matters, but honestly speaking, this is what I'm expecting for several years already, that the current situation is unrealistic to stick to. And let's be very pragmatic here. This is not about so-called big politics. This is also about certain incompatibility of countries, very natural incompatibility. You cannot have the same policies for countries such as Luxembourg on one side and Bulgaria on the other. And this is not a criticism of Bulgaria, but simply people living in those countries are facing very different problems. They have very different ambitions, expectations from life. So to have this illusion that we might have one speed Europe in times of discrepancies, and I would say even disparatabilities in those countries. I don't believe that can last forever. But the worst thing about the European Union these days is that when you have certain incompatibilities within a large club, which you are trying to homogenize to a certain extent, there might be a moment when actually everybody is unsatisfied. Those countries who would like to push forward certain reforms, certain changes, they are reluctant already to wait for those who are just catching up. And those who are just trying to catch up, they might be very nervous and paralyzed by certain speed of those who basically started certain processes decades ago. It's basic. This is not that difficult to understand in many ways. And if we are very serious about accepting countries of from the Balkan area and Ukraine, we are suddenly facing a problem that we saw in case of Bulgaria, Greece, countries that simply are not sharing the very same tradition of being part of so-called Western civilization. I don't see it as to be a problem which cannot be solved, and I don't see it as a precondition of being a part of the European Union, but simply it's bringing certain problems that fathers of the whole European idea didn't expect. Right. But also reactions of elites might be very different in those countries, precisely because they are living in certain in certain area which is also culturally slightly different. And that is the story of Slovakia as well, by the way, in spite of the fact that Slovakia was always part of the West, for 1,000 years. But it was always on the edge.
Let's try to end on a more positive note, Michal. What do you see Slovakia to be like in, let's say, 8 to 10 years? So after the potential 2 terms that Fico will maybe get, is there a positive that Slovakia will get out of this in the 10 years?
Yes, I'm relatively optimistic here. It will be very pessimistic at the beginning, but I will change the tone at the end. I believe that Slovakia is going to lose several years now. It's going to waste those years that are going to come. There will be no significant reforms. Slovakia is already economically not in the best shape. It might be even deepening. Slovaks will learn their lesson. And those who are skeptically saying that Slovaks were learning their lessons in last 30 years for several times and they didn't learn a lot, I would suggest that yes. But I have also one positive moment here. In 90s, in 97, 98, many Slovaks realized that although some of them were not that critical about Mečiar regime, but they understood that it's not replicable, that simply you cannot continue. And the same was in 1989. Some people were not that critical about communist regime, but let's say, at least from economic point of view, they understood that this is something that has to finish. We cannot live like this. And I believe this will happen to Slovakia again. When all bad solutions will be tested, Slovaks will find a way to better solutions, those which might be eventually applied already now, but unfortunately they will be not.
Brilliant. It was actually a really optimistic ending because, yes, there will be some trial and error, but hopefully all good things will eventually come. Michal, thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us on a Friday evening. I really appreciate it. Thanks to everyone who watched the interview. Go visit Slovakia. It's a beautiful country. Bratislava is stunning. It's turning into a really modern city. I would even say more modern than Prague these days. So do go check it out. Thank you again, Michal. Have a great evening and talk to you soon.
Thank you very much for the invitation and all the best.